Good morning. This is Dr. Bryson for Juvenile Justice. This is a brief video, comparatively brief, on the doctrine of parens patriae in the U.S. I'm going to go through some cases and basically how our philosophies have changed throughout the decades. So parens patriae is a doctrine that began under British common law, and it means the state is the parent. Look at these two words and what might they sound like for English words. Parens might sound like parent, and patriae might sound a little bit like the word patriotic. So there are some correlates going on here. The state is the parent. So just try to remember that from Latin terms. Parens patriae began in British common law to protect the estates of children who had lost their parents, but they were too young to really manage the estate themselves. For that reason, the government took over in loco parentes, in the place of parents, and managed the estate until that child came of age. Eventually, that doctrine in British common law also got applied to other areas, neglect, abuse, when the child was acting in a delinquent way, and the parents did not seem to be able to control the child. That's the doctrine of parens patriae. Well, enter the houses of refuge here in the U.S., early 1800s. And then we have the case of Mary Ann Krause. Now, this is a photo of Mary Ann Krause as an older woman, but in the early 1800s, the first half of the 19th century, Mary Ann Krause's mother thought that she couldn't control her, so she took her before the courts and had her placed in a house of refuge. Unfortunately, Mary Ann's father was not aware that the mother was doing this, and when he learned that the mother had done this, he challenged it and filed a habeas corpus petition. Now, the houses of refuge were still pretty young at the time. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which was the highest court that heard the case, it did not go above the Pennsylvania Supreme Court at that time. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled 4 different things. Now, this is actually in chapter 4 of the textbook, The Cycle of Juvenile Justice, 2nd edition by Bernard and Kurlichek. But page 61 in table 4.1, the column labeled Krause case gives us the 4 parts of their decision. They said that the houses of refuge had good intentions, that they were helping and treating Mary Ann. They said that the doctrine of parens patriae applied, therefore due process was not required for Mary Ann. In other words, the intentions were good and they're actually helping her. So they made those 2 points. But then they also said, because Mary Ann was a delinquent youth, and what we're really trying to do is change her behavior so that she will have a better life in the future, we don't have to give her due process, because we're not punishing her, we're helping her and treating her because of this doctrines of parens patriae. Therefore, she does not deserve, or I'm sorry, doesn't need due process. Now, I messed that up on purpose. Okay. Well, if we fast forward then to after the Civil War, because Mary Ann Krause was before, and then we can fast forward to after the Civil War, the child savers, especially in large cities like New York and Chicago, and remember, Chicago was a very fast-growing city. The child savers in Chicago, firm believers in parens patriae, children's due process rights were being violated significantly because of parens patriae, until we get to Daniel O'Connell. Now, this picture I couldn't find a picture of Daniel O'Connell. So this picture is the result of Daniel O'Connell that we'll get to in just a second. The Illinois Supreme Court decided or held that for Daniel O'Connell, the houses of refuge, they didn't consider the intent, they considered the actual performance and said, these places aren't working. This house of refuge isn't working. It's not doing what it says it's doing. We don't care what the intent is. We care about the actual performance, and it's not good. They then said, and that means that Daniel O'Connell's not being treated there. He's being punished. And because he's being punished, now Krause had not been accused of breaking any law, and O'Connell had not broken any law. But because he's being punished, that means that in order to place him in the house of refuge, criminal law applies. And if we're going to apply criminal law, you cannot place him there without due process. That was the O'Connell case. But now these child savers, and Anthony Platt wrote a book in the late 60s, 1960s that is, and the book is still available in print. My edition is a 50th anniversary edition. But Platt wrote a book on the child savers in the late 1960s, where he claims that their intent was not always a positive intent. But the child savers didn't like the O'Connell decision, because that means for them at this time, that means that they can't just put these teenagers that are on the street that they think need to be saved into houses of refuge or into these other programs, residential places, without due process of law. So it takes them about 20 years, but they finally get the Illinois legislature to pass a juvenile court law. Now, the city of Memphis in Tennessee claims that it has the first juvenile court ever. They may have, but it was not legislatively authorized. In other words, they kind of went outside of what the Tennessee legislature allowed or had established in order to do their juvenile court. Illinois, Cook County, which is the county of Chicago, had the first official legislatively created juvenile court in the US. This reversed the O'Connell case decision. So now the legislature has reversed that decision. So now we've got Parens patriae again. Now, under the intent of Parens patriae, the idea is that we are trying to diagnose the problem, treat it, and fix it so that these juveniles will come into adulthood with that problem fixed, so they won't be diagnosed, so they won't be diagnosable with pauperism. Yes, that was a literal diagnosis back in those days, so that they won't be a drain on society, and so that they'll have a better life for themselves. Now, that was the idea, but keep in mind, the idea is we're trying to fix them. Now, adolescence itself as a stage of life began with the Industrial Revolution. Pretty much. The idea that youth that age were not fully developed mentally was still around, but truly adolescence as a stage of life has typically been around more since the Industrial Revolution than prior. But especially during the early half of the 20th century, from 1901, when Illinois got its first juvenile court, into the 1950s, so that roughly 55 to 60 years, that idea that of adolescence really developed. And by the 1950s, we were beginning to see teen angst movies. So let's talk about a teen angst movie. James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause. This movie came out when my mother was in high school. So this is my mother's generation. I got to see the movie for the first time at the Orpheum Theater in Memphis, Tennessee, on the big screen for classic movie nights during the summers that they would do back in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And I remember watching it and thinking how cheesy it was. At the time, I was working in the juvenile justice system. I was a therapist working in the juvenile justice system um, uh, through a community mental health center that had a youth program. And I just thought how melodramatic this movie is. But the more I began to study, because I was fairly young in those days, still in my 20s, so I began to study more about juvenile justice. And Rebel Without a Cause actually gives a really good presentation of the ideal of juvenile justice from the 1950s. It does not give a good presentation of the realities of how that system worked. Now, it's mostly about the teen angst and the dysfunctional families. For me, it's no surprise that this movie preceded in everything that it presents about the juvenile justice system, as well as about dysfunctional families, preceded movements in the 1960s and early 1970s about treating dysfunctional families, but also Supreme Court decisions in the 1960s that altered our view of juvenile justice some. The opening scene of Rebel Without a Cause shows James Dean, and his character's name is Jim, Natalie Wood, and her character's name is Judy, and Sal Mineo, and they call him Plato, his character's name is Plato in the movie. They are at the police station, but they're at the juvenile division. And they're at the juvenile division because the officers, the police officers in the juvenile division are trained to try to help figure out what the problem is, try to keep them out of going to the court. It's just interesting how it's presented. So Salminio's his character's Plato, he's a child of very wealthy parents, and they're never there. The maid is raising him. It's his birthday, and his parents didn't even come home or send him a gift. He's very angry, and we learn that from the police because the parents, I mean, through the interaction with the police, it's because the way the parents are, and the maid, and this is in the 1950s, so the maid is black, and they present her in a somewhat stereotypical way for the 1950s, but at the same time, the comments that she makes and her character is not that significant in the movie as far as amount of time in the scenes, but when her character is there, her character is very significant because she has the wisest things to say about parenting. So it's a movie that presents the stereotype, but presents it in a way that is subtly trying to change it. It's trying to change parenting because there were problems believed by Hollywood with the parenting in the 1950s. Judy, Natalie Wood's character, when she went through puberty and physically developed, so her body's more like a woman's body than a little girl's body, her father stopped being affectionate towards her and became emotionally cold. And we kind of figure that out in that first scene, but as the movie goes on, we actually see some scenes between her and her father. But because she wears makeup, her father calls her dirty names. And then Jim, because James Dean was the bigger star during all of this, Jim, his parents live with his maternal grandmother, and his father's kind of wimpy. Now, if you watch this movie and you've ever seen Gilligan's Island, you'll soon realize that the man who plays Jim's father in the movie plays Thurston Howell, the rich guy, in Gilligan's Island. So if you watch any of those reruns, that's where you've seen it. There's a scene, there's a point in that first scene where James Dean says to his family as they're arguing about him, "You're tearing me apart." Just very melodramatic. That's part of why he got arrested for being drunk. He's getting himself drunk to deal with the pain. But so Jim's taken back into the police officer's office, the juvenile officer's office, and the officer's trying to get to the bottom of what's causing him to be drunk. And Jim takes a punch at him. And the officer just kind of moves out of the way and shoves him down. And then he immediately takes his sidearm off of his waist and puts it in his desk drawer to communicate to Jim, "I'm not dangerous. I'm not a threat to you, man." And then a few seconds later, he says, "You know, Jim, I wish when you'd taken that punch at me, you'd connected. It might have given you a little bit of confidence in yourself." Can anybody see a police officer of any kind doing that today? They didn't do it then, and they ain't going to do it today. Okay. But the movie is presenting the ideal. You see, this officer is trying to get to the bottom of why they're acting out. That's the whole purpose of it. Well, let's move forward into the 1960s now. 1964, the year I was born. Gerald Galt was sent to juvenile detention because he was already on juvenile probation. He was sent to juvenile detention the day after he was placed on juvenile probation because a neighbor called his juvenile probation officer and said, "Hey, Gerald made an obscene phone call to me." So the probation officer, well, Gerald and a friend. So the probation officer comes and arrests Gerald. It takes his family, I believe it was 3 days before they actually found out where he was and what happened to him. They didn't know if he'd run away. They had no idea. He was never presented with charges. He was never allowed to cross-examine witnesses. And as a result, he was placed in juvenile detention until he turned 21 years old. Now, this happened in Gila County, Arizona. By the way, Gila is spelled Gila, but the G is pronounced like an H because of the language. Now, he was placed in juvenile detention until he turned 21 years old. This case then was appealed through the system, and it got to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in a case called N. Re. Galt, with Chief Justice Earl Warren still there, hearing the oral arguments, it was decided that because he was placed in detention, that his due process rights were violated. See, Gila County believed that because this is 6 years of treatment we're going to be giving him, right? We're giving him treatment for 6 years. Well, 7 years. He was 14 at the time, and then he was going to be released when he was 21. Well, if he'd done the exact same thing as an adult, the worst sentence he could have gotten was a fine and 6 months in jail. That's it. That's the worst he could have gotten. The Supreme Court literally said the fact of being a juvenile does not mean that this child should be subjected to a kangaroo court. They overturned the state court and said, no, you have to give him due process. Well, Galt had always wanted to join the Army, and he joined the Army, and as an adult, he had a very responsible and distinguished career and actually retired. It's my understanding that this photo is his taken around the time of his retirement, if not at his retirement party. But you can see he's much older than a teenager right here, right? You can see the ribbons on his chest. So he was a decorated serviceman. Kind of goes to demonstrate that just because someone acts up as a juvenile doesn't mean they're going to act up as an adult. He didn't need the treatment that they were giving him to become this responsible adult. Well, if we fast forward past Henry Galt, because what happened then was, oh, if we got to give them due process, then we're going to make the sentences for juvenile crimes harsher. We're going to make it easier to transfer them from juvenile court to adult court, waive them on to adult court, get them charged and convicted as an adult, in other words. And things did not fare well. So now we get into the 80s and movies like Colors, which is about gangs in Los Angeles with Robert Duvall and Sean Penn. So, here we are, all the dangerous gangs. And then we get into the early 90s. And one sociologist mentioned the term super predator. And then Hillary Clinton, campaigning for her husband for president, starts talking about super predators and how we've got to knuckle down on crime with juveniles. Interesting thing, when she made that comment, the US was in the very early stages of a 30+ year decline in juvenile delinquency. So, but all of a sudden we had the super predators, and at the same time fueling this was the case of Yummy. Yummy is a real 11-year-old who was executed by the gang that he was a member of. Now, when this says the last days of a Southside Shorty, in those days, 11-year-olds could get away with things because they were too young to be convicted as an adult or even transferred to adult court at that time. They could get away with doing certain things with very short sentences that the older gang members couldn't. So they relied on them to do some things. Well, Yummy was a bully from very young age before he ever joined a gang. They called him Yummy, by the way, because of his complete love of sweets, more than most kids. He actually went and tried to kill someone for the gang without being assigned this by the gang. And he ends up killing a little girl. Well, everybody knows who he is. He's too young to know how to hide it. But he goes into hiding and the gang helps him. And then he's told he's going to be gotten out of Chicago, and two gang members come to pick him up, and then they take him to a place in Chicago and they execute him for it. And those two guys are still in prison. But Yummy, because of that, was on the cover of Time magazine. Now there's a graphic novel that is targeted to middle school kids called Yummy, The Last Days of the Southside Shorty. And you see the picture of that covered here. We went from the state is going to be the parent in the sense of we're going to try to train these children to, well, the state's going to be the parent, but we're going to follow that. If you spare the rod, you're going to spoil the child. So we're not going to spare the rod. Okay. Well, fast forward from the early 90s, and then we get to 2012 with Miller v. Alabama, where we finally start to realize that younger children, and according to our textbook, we just flip to the other part of the cycle. But children they don't understand like adults do. So Miller v. Alabama was kind of the final nail in the coffin of the Get Tough on Youth. The death penalty for crimes committed before 18 had already been declared cruel and unusual punishment and outlawed by the U.S. Supreme Court. And in Miller v. Alabama, mandatory life without the possibility of parole also was removed as an option for juveniles. There has to be due process. In other words, it's not an either-or proposition. It's not either they don't need due process because we're rehabilitating them, or they do need due process because we're convicting them as adults. No, it's to that place where we're giving them due process because they still deserve due process, but in that due process, we understand that they are children and their brains have not developed biologically to the point where they will when they're fully formed as an adult, that they don't have life experiences. There are so many things that go into that. Parens patriae began this whole process in the US. And it seems like, hopefully, that we're at a place where we're stopping the cycle, because we're finding a way of integrating due process with the understanding that they're children that need help. And when we integrate those two, and we don't just take a harsh attitude simply because we think we should take a harsh attitude, we're going to do a much better job at responding to juvenile delinquency. Now, one word about Bernard and Kurlichek's book. It's called The Cycle of Juvenile Justice, where at that point, the most recent edition was published before the 2012 Miller v. Alabama decision. Bernard died suddenly, so Kurlichek has just not redone and updated for a third edition. My hope is that she eventually will. But this book, looks at the cycle, and so as you read it through the semester, you're going to see the cycle and how we keep going back and forth. I want you to learn that in this class. I want you to start to develop an attitude of, let's focus on what's going to work to, first of all, help these juveniles and keep the public safe. We can do both of those. We can do both of those. How can we treat juveniles as juveniles and keep the public safe? We can do both. We can do both. So as you read this book, pay attention to the points that Bernard and Kurlichek make. I use this book. This is because it is so well written and just really gets that information to you in a very cogent, logical way. I want you to be aware of it. I've gone on just a bit too long, so let me stop the screen share and say I appreciate that you've stuck with the video, and we will see you next time.